While Alzayat is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, a Washington-based think tank, he's previously worked as the former Syria outreach coordinator with the US State Department, and he joins us live now. Thank you for your time. Firstly, you were a Syria advisor to the former US ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, under the previous Obama administration. What do you make of this latest strike under Donald Trump?
Thank you for having me. I mean, certainly this is a serious escalation on the part of the United States in response to what seems to be credible evidence that the regime has used chemical weapons in violation of international norms and its previous commitments. So therefore, this is a necessary step, in my opinion, but one that carries certain risks in terms of potentially getting the United States involved in a direct confrontation, not only with the regime, but with its allies, particularly the Russians, perhaps the Iranians. Although it seems that if these attacks are going to remain limited, and that's what the Secretary of State has said, that might be the end of this round right now, and we'll see what the Russians and their allies will do in response.
Yes, we've heard some responses from Russia. Moscow has condemned these attacks as illegal, contrary to peace, achieving peace in Syria. What might Russia do in response to these attacks?
You know, I think that one of the things they can do is perhaps complicate counter-ISIL operations in Syria by making it more difficult for U.S. pilots to fly over Syrian airspace, or perhaps to allow pro-regime, pro-Iranian, or even Russian mercenaries, militias to harass U.S. forces, particularly those in the north or their Kurdish allies. But beyond that, I think it's just going to be rhetoric.
Yes, and Donald Trump has now launched 2 sets of airstrikes in response to suspected chemical attacks launched by the Syrian regime. Meanwhile, the former President Obama identified the use of chemical weapons as a so-called red line, but didn't take any action against Syria as a result. Do you think that was the wrong move on Obama's part?
Look, these decisions are not to be taken lightly, and none of us are sitting in the White House to make these difficult choices. But in my opinion, as somebody who did work on the file for many years at the State Department, I think it was a mistake. I think there was opportunities to enforce certain parameters, to send a clear signal to the regime and its allies of what is permissible and not permissible in Syria. And we missed the opportunity, and I suspect the regime learned those lessons and escalated accordingly, and the consequences have been millions of people displaced and over 500,000 people dead.
Now, as someone who's analysed Syria for many years now, how do you think Bashar al-Assad might react to these airstrikes? Would this deter him to deploy chemical weapons in the future?
I think in the short term, yes. That's a classic Assad move. It's kind of a cat and mouse game where he will, look, he cares mainly about regime survival. So he will get the message. He will probably instruct his forces not to use the material. But then once the pressure eases off again and he's having a hard time fleshing out the opposition or acquiring more territory from their supporters, he may be tempted, or his forces might be tempted to use it again. So really, to establish true deterrence in Syria against Bashar al-Assad, you need sustained and forceful military action whenever he crosses certain, I hate to use the term red line, but we will use it here. But I really don't think for CW is enough. It needs to be established against any targeting of civilians, whether via chemical weapons, barrel bombs, or besiegement of towns. And if that's not established, he will always find ways to crush his opposition so he can stay in power.
We know that Russia has been one of Bashar al-Assad's strongest allies over the course of the civil war. Why is Moscow so heavily invested in Syria and in propping up the Assad regime?
You know, Russia has a long history going back to the days of the Soviet Union of supporting the Syrian regime. It has deep political, diplomatic, economic, and military ties with Syria. Syria provides it now, I think, the only naval bases to the Mediterranean. It is one of its few allies in the region, particularly after the toppling of, not allies, but even friends of Saddam and Gaddafi in Libya. Russia is seeking to restore its prestige. And in a sense, it has been able to show in the world that it can go toe to toe with the United States, that it's no longer the weak Russia of the post Soviet Union era that lost Bosnia, Kosovo, and the other countries I mentioned. And really, it's given it an opportunity now to flex its muscle and to, in a way, intimidate other countries to toe its line, whether in Eastern Europe or elsewhere. So there are many reasons here, and I do think that the Russians view Assad as the same as the Syrian regime at this point, and I think letting go of him for them would equal concessions and a defeat to the United States and the West, which is unfortunate because at this point, the only solution in Syria requires Assad to step down or to be removed down the line. He's just a war criminal.
Okay, Wael Alzayat, thank you so much for your insights from Washington, D.C.